I never imagined a casual family barbecue would spiral into the HOA president banning my entire family from visiting me. But when they crossed a federal judge's son, they couldn't have predicted he'd wield his legal authority to ban them from the county. What would you do if someone tried to keep your family away from you? The scent of sizzling burgers wafted through my backyard as my sister, Sarah, chased her laughing kids through the sprinkler. After 6 months apart, their weekend visit meant the world to me. I'd moved to Maple Grove Estates 3 months earlier, lured by its pristine parks and tidy streets. No one warned me about Margaret Hensley. "Excuse me, what's going on here?" A sharp voice sliced through our joy. I turned to see a woman in her 50s, her dark hair impeccably styled, striding across my lawn. Her stiff blazer was buttoned up despite the summer heat, and she gripped a clipboard like a shield. "Just hosting a family barbecue," I said, spatula in hand. "I'm Daniel Carter, new here. Can I help you?" Her gaze sharpened as she counted Sarah's kids. "Are these people registered guests?" Sarah shot me a puzzled look. I was just as confused. "Registered? They're my family, here for the weekend." Margaret's stance stiffened. "I'm Margaret Hensley, president of the Maple Grove Homeowners Association. Per our bylaws, all visitors must be registered with the HOA office 72 hours in advance." I chuckled, assuming it was a joke. The kids froze, sensing the shift. That can't be right. No one mentioned registering family when I bought the place. "It's in the covenant you signed, Mr. Carter. Page 47, Bylaw 3.12. She pointed at Sarah's SUV in the driveway. "Unregistered visitors, noise disturbance, and that vehicle's parked incorrectly." Sarah stepped forward. "The kids are just playing, they're not that loud." Margaret ignored her. "As HOA president, I enforce community standards. This is your first formal warning." She scribbled on her clipboard. 3 warnings lead to fines." I set down my spatula. I didn't know about this rule. "I'll register them Monday." "That's not how it works. They must leave now and return after registration," Margaret said with a tight smile. "Rules protect our property values, Mr. Carter." My father, who'd been watching quietly from the patio, stood up. At 65, Judge Robert Carter still exuded authority without raising his voice. "Margaret, is it? I'm Daniel's father. Are you saying my grandchildren can't visit their uncle without paperwork?" Her eyes widened briefly. "And you are?" "Robert Carter, federal judge, Eastern District." She straightened her blazer. "Even judges must follow HOA rules, sir. They apply to everyone." Dad nodded thoughtfully. "Interesting. I'd love to see the legal precedent for an HOA restricting family visitation on private property." Margaret flushed. "The covenant is a binding contract. Your son agreed to it. Does it explicitly require pre-approval for family?" Dad asked mildly. "It says all visitors." "I'll overlook this violation just once," she said, as if doing us a favor. "But register future guests." As she marched off, Dad sat down. "Interesting woman. Sorry about that," I told Sarah. "Neighborhood politics. Does she always patrol backyards?" Sarah asked. "First time I've seen it." "Probably nothing," I said. We resumed the barbecue, but the carefree vibe was gone. My nephew, Liam, only 7, asked if they'd be kicked out. "Of course not, bud," I reassured him. "She's just strict about rules." That night, after the kids were asleep, Dad and I sipped beers on the patio. "That HOA president," he said quietly, "reminds me of cases I've seen." "What kind?" "People who mistake authority for power." He took a sip. "Read your HOA covenant carefully, son." I shrugged. "It's probably nothing. An overzealous board member." Dad didn't seem convinced. "People who monitor kids playing in backyards rarely stop there." I didn't know then how right he was, or that Margaret had cameras at every neighborhood entrance, or that she was already emailing the board about my non-compliant attitude. Sarah's family left Sunday afternoon. Monday morning, I found a formal warning on my door citing 3 violations from the weekend, alongside a flyer naming Margaret Hensley as Grand Marshal for the 4th of July celebration. I had no clue this was just the start, or that my quiet father was already planning his next move. "Happy birthday to you." Mom's off-key singing echoed in my kitchen as she carried in a chocolate cake with candles. Dad followed with a gift box. Their surprise visit for my 35th birthday lifted my spirits after a tough week. "You didn't have to drive 3 hours," I said, touched. "Nonsense," Mom replied, setting down the cake. We'd never miss it. We settled on the porch with iced tea, enjoying the evening. Dad asked about work. I'd just gotten a promotion, and all felt right until I noticed a black SUV circling the block. Someone lost. Mom wondered. It parked across the street, and Margaret emerged with a balding man in a polo and a thin woman with sharp glasses. They marched toward my house like a squad. Daniel Carter. Margaret called before reaching my walkway. Identify those people on your porch immediately. My stomach sank. These are my parents, Margaret. They surprised me for my birthday. The man pulled out a tablet. No visitor registration on file. Violation number 2, Carter. I'm Paul Ridley, HOA Vice President. He smirked. And I'm Linda Voss, Secretary, the woman added. Margaret stepped onto my porch uninvited. Unregistered guests are prohibited. We take security seriously. Mom looked stunned. Security? We're just visiting our son. Without registration, we can't verify who you are, Linda said, adjusting her glasses. You could be anyone. Dad stood slowly. We met last month. Robert Carter, Daniel's father. Margaret's lips thinned. Yes, the judge. Even you must respect our rules. Legal professionals also understand reasonable versus unreasonable restrictions, Dad replied calmly. Paul stepped forward. We're issuing a $500 fine, effective immediately. He handed me a pink slip. Payment due in 10 days. $500 because my parents visited? I choked. The first violation was a warning, Margaret said with forced patience. Second violations carry penalties, Section 7 of the Covenant. This is absurd, I said. It's my birthday. Rules apply to everyone, Linda snapped, or they're meaningless. Dad touched my arm. Daniel, may I see the bylaw they're citing? Margaret's smile didn't reach her eyes. Perhaps you should review the covenant, Judge Carter. This isn't your courtroom. Paul snapped photos of Mom's car. Documentation purposes. Is that necessary? Mom asked. We document all violations, Margaret replied coldly. They left, marching back to the SUV. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, some ducking when I looked. I'm so sorry, I told my parents. I didn't expect this. Dad studied the fine. $500 is excessive for a family visit. Have you read the full covenant? I admitted I'd only skimmed it. You've got a problem, son, he said. This behavior doesn't usually stop on its own. Mom frowned. Will we need to register every visit? No way, I said firmly. This is ridiculous. That night, I dug out the covenant. The visitor policy mentioned extended stays and community amenities, not family visits. The next morning, I visited my neighbor, Greg, who'd lived here 5 years. Has the HOA always been this strict? Greg glanced around nervously. It got bad when Margaret took over last year. Before, the rules existed but weren't enforced like this. Anyone fight back? The Lopez family tried when fined for their grandparents' Christmas visit. Their trash wasn't picked up for weeks, route mix-ups, and they got weekly landscaping notices. That afternoon, I found a note in my mailbox. Board meeting Tuesday, 7 p.m. Your attendance requested. And signed, but Margaret's handwriting. I called Dad. He went quiet. What's on your mind? I asked. I'm thinking it's time to check what powers your HOA legally has under county law, he said, his voice shifting to what Mom called his courtroom tone. And what powers they don't have. My phone rang at 5:30 a.m. It was Sarah, panicked. Dan, my water broke. The baby's coming 6 weeks early. I bolted up. Stay calm. I'm coming. She and her husband, Mike, were staying with me during their home renovation. The doctor had said the baby wasn't due for weeks. I rushed to their room, helped Sarah to my car, and sped off as Mike grabbed their hospital bag. Sarah groaned, clutching her belly. As I backed out, headlights blinded me. Margaret's SUV blocked my driveway. She stepped out with Paul and 2 others. Going somewhere with unregistered guests, she asked, pointing at Sarah, who was moaning. My sister's in labor. I shouted. Move your car. You should have considered emergencies before breaking rules, Margaret said. Mike ran up. Please, our baby's early. She needs a hospital. Paul started recording. More violations. This is a medical emergency. I yelled. Rules don't bend for emergencies, Margaret said, checking her watch. I'll need a doctor's note to confirm this isn't a ruse. Sarah screamed. I saw blood. Call an ambulance. I told Mike. Margaret hesitated but didn't move. Neighbors emerged, watching. Mrs. Evans from across the street ran over in her robe. Margaret, what are you doing? She needs help. Stay out of this, Helen, Margaret snapped. HOA business. 10 agonizing minutes later, paramedics arrived, forced to wheel a gurney around Margaret's SUV. They loaded Sarah in, and Mike climbed aboard. I glared at Margaret. Move your car, she announced loudly. The board has voted. Due to repeated violations, all unregistered guests are banned from Maple Grove. Your family's not welcome. Neighbors gasped. You can't ban families. Mrs. Evans protested. Section 47.3 gives us emergency powers, Paul said, waving his tablet. I had to get to the hospital, not argue. My father will hear about this. Margaret smirked. Tell your judge his title means nothing here. She finally moved. I sped off, hands trembling. Sarah delivered a tiny, healthy girl an hour later. While she rested, I called Dad. You won't believe this. I explained. He went silent. Then, text me Margaret and Paul's full names and addresses. What's the plan? Nothing illegal, he said. But no one endangers my granddaughter. That night, Dad arrived at the hospital, no longer the laid-back guy from our barbecue. This was Judge Robert Carter, who'd faced down crooks. I've made calls, he said. The county records show Maple Grove's HOA was improperly incorporated. Half their bylaws aren't filed, and Margaret's using an invalid title. Can that help? Mike asked. It's a start, Dad said, eyes gleaming. Paul's landscaping firm has an exclusive HOA contract, approved by the board he sits on. He had a plan brewing. Daniel, check your mailbox tomorrow for a property tax letter. Why? Because, he said with a faint smile, those taxes fund the county, which oversees HOAs. And I know the oversight committee chair. As we spoke, neighbors texted me photos. Margaret and Paul setting up cones at the entrance with a sign, Visitor Checkpoint, HOA approval required. They've lost it, I muttered. Dad nodded. Some of this is illegal. County vehicles rolled into Maple Grove the next morning, officials carrying boxes into the HOA office. Mrs. Evans texted, big stuff at HOA HQ. Margaret's livid. I hurried out. Neighbors watched as Margaret argued with a tall woman in a suit. You can't demand documents. Margaret yelled. This is private property. Under County Code 43.7, we can inspect all records, the woman replied, showing papers. Margaret spotted me with Dad. You did this, she accused. Dad smiled. If your records are clean, you've got nothing to worry about. Her face paled. 20 years I've run this place. We keep out undesirables. By barring families? Dad asked. She stormed off. Neighbors buzzed. Rumors flew about inflated fees and Paul's overpaid landscaping gigs. A reporter, Emily Tate from the County Chronicle, approached. Comment on the investigation? Before I could answer, Sarah called. The baby's oxygen had dropped. I'm coming, I said, rushing off. Margaret and Paul lingered near my driveway. Niece in ICU? Paul sneered. The band stands. I snapped, recording on my phone. If you block me again during an emergency, every news outlet will know your names. At the hospital, Dad confirmed the baby was stable. The investigation's escalating, he said. They found hidden financials. Paul's firm got triple market rates, and Margaret paid her sister's consulting firm. That night, an emergency HOA meeting packed the community center. Margaret opened stiffly, but neighbors demanded answers. Did you profit off contracts? Why ban families? Chaos erupted. Margaret pointed at me. This is his fault. Him and his judge father. I stood. I just wanted my family to visit without being criminals. This is about accountability. The county woman stepped in. We found evidence of fraud. This board suspended. The room gasped. Margaret hissed at Dad. You've declared war. No, he said. I've declared legality. 6 months later, I watched my nieces splash in our new community pool, funded by recovered HOA funds. Margaret got 7 years. The corruption spanned 17 communities. I'd been elected HOA president. Our first rule, all families welcome anytime. What started with a barbecue had toppled a corrupt empire. Sometimes, the smallest fights unveil the biggest wrongs.